I have a tough job tonight because I have to talk about something that's not good news. And I'll just try and do my best with it. And what's best for the party, at least to understand what's going on. The workers and peasants of Brazil, the population of Brazil, and the people of Latin America and the entire world are facing a serious crisis. Or I should say, the Brazilians are facing a crisis that affects the rest of the world. In 10 days, someone who campaigns as an open and blatant misogynist, racist, and anti-LGBTQ candidate, who was also a candidate against all poor and working people, against unions, is the front runner in the second round of the presidential election. Right now, he's favored to win. His name is Jair Bolsonaro, and he threatens not only Brazil, but the progressive governments. His election would add to the threat to the progressive governments in Latin America, including Bolivia, Cuba, and especially in the short run, Venezuela. For our party, also, his possible ascension to the presidency represents a challenge. Admittedly, we have no real way of materially changing the outcome of the election, but we should know what position we take on it. It's enough to note the support that Bolsonaro received from the pro-fascist ideologue Steve Bannon during the first election to see where Bolsonaro fits in the worldwide developments that are going on. In the imperialist United States and in many of the European imperialist countries, as well as some in Eastern Europe, there is a similar threat, or there are actually ultra-right-wing governments, or threats from fascist-type parties, leaders. Should Bolsonaro win the second round of the election, it will buoy up these forces globally. Bolsonaro's opponent in the election, it's now down to two since they had the first part and it eliminated the candidates with fewer votes, is a relatively little-known moderate politician in the Workers' Party, which is PT in Brazilian Portuguese, Partido do Trabalho. And his name is Fernando Haddad. And he's a university professor, an economist, who was for a while the mayor of São Paulo, and he was part of, I think, Dilma Rousseff's government for a couple of years. Had some cabinet post. Haddad's running mate, the vice presidential candidate, is Manuela Dávila of the Communist Party of Brazil. What they call PCdoB. Because there's two communist parties. This is a bigger one, and it's more lined up with the social democratic parties. There's also the Brazilian Communist Party, which is more isolated and more to the left. According to my evaluation, and just mine, if we existed in Brazil, or if we had more influence there, we would call for a vote for the Haddad-Dávila coalition in the coming election, and we would campaign for it. We would also support any mass mobilizations opposing Bolsonaro. That's with regard to the election itself. The election is, of course, not the be-all and end-all of the class struggle in Brazil. That struggle will continue no matter who wins the election. And even if Haddad manages to upset Bolsonaro in the next 10 days, the danger Bolsonaro poses will still remain. We know this, and we tend to focus on that aspect. However, Bolsonaro's electoral victory would still put our class and the people in society we defend at a disadvantage in the coming period. His defeat in the polls, on the other hand, would encourage the forces we align with, and it would at least buy some time to mobilize. Comrade Berta wrote about the impeachment of the last Workers' Party president, Dilma Rousseff, which took place in 2016. I think Berta spoke, I can't remember for sure. I wrote a few news articles in September on it, but otherwise we have had little opportunity to discuss what's a pretty important question in the hemisphere, Brazil. recently. So I want to go over some basic information just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about. I mean, maybe it's elementary, but you never know. Brazil has a population of about 208 million people. There's an area of more than 3 million square miles, which makes it about the same size as the United States or China. Brazil borders every other country in South America except Chile and Ecuador. This means also that it has about half the area of all of South America and more than half the population. From the 1500s to the 19th century, Portugal ruled Brazil. Most other South American countries were ruled by Spain, which accounts for the language being Brazilian Portuguese in Brazil. The wealthier settlers seized the lands of the indigenous inhabitants, not without decades of heroic resistance, I should say, that someday we should study, and enslaved African people. They brought enslaved African people to work on plantations. At this time, about half the current population has some African ancestors, and Brazil was the last country in the hemisphere where legal slavery was ended. Economically, Brazil has the 9th, well, Taryn told me the 7th, but it's somewhere up there, largest economy in the world. It is also among the most unequal countries in the world in terms of wealth and incomes, how it's distributed. The northeast of Brazil, the part up on near the Atlantic, is dry and very poor. Most of Brazil's industry and most of its population live in the southeast, around where the big cities are: Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, Belo Horizonte. Brasilia is the capital, which is inland. Brazil has a rich culture. And these cities are surrounded by favelas. What's the other word for that? Shanty towns, with very poor people living in it, mostly of African descent. Brazil has a rich culture with great contributions from African and indigenous people. I won't pretend to present this history and culture in depth. They're worthy of more education and discussion from someone with more knowledge than I have. More recently, from the 1964 military coup that overthrew a president named João Goulart, until 1985, Brazil's military ran the country. They killed and tortured revolutionaries, worker leaders, indigenous leaders. They tortured, in fact, Dilma Rousseff when she was a captured member of a guerrilla organization. Bolsonaro speaks favorably of that period, which gives you an idea where he's at. I'm not going to directly quote this pig, who was a retired Army captain. I don't want his words on my lips. If you haven't read them, think of what Trump says that's offensive and double it. The Brazilian bourgeoisie ran the elected government from 1985 to 2003, kind of directly, with their political leaders, what they call neoliberal leaders and stuff. They always give nicknames to the presidents. So when they call Dilma, it's not really an insult. That's just, they call everybody that. Lula is Lula. And Cardoso was LHC. They called him his initials. Anyway, Lula was a machinist and a union leader. He won the election in 2002, and he was president for 8 years. And then Dilma Rousseff won and was president from 2009, was re-elected in 2012, and was there until 2016, when she was impeached and thrown out. Lula's election, the Workers' Party is a social democratic party. It's not a party organized like a Leninist party that's, has disciplined members. It's an electoral party. It has support from the labor unions. His election was not a revolution. It did not change property relations. Nor did Lula or the Workers' Party during the period from 2003 to 2016, when it was in office, mobilize the poor and workers in their own organizations. However, during the Lula administrations especially, there was enormous economic growth, which was financed mainly by because raw materials that Brazil was able to sell and other commodities they produced they were able to sell for high prices at that period. And the government passed laws which gave a guaranteed income to the very poor and to retired people. And it moved, I would say, something like 30 million people out of really abject poverty into a condition of living and a sort of welfare payments. And a lot of them were in the northeast of Brazil, and that's why the Workers' Party still, even after all the attacks on the Workers' Party and the attempts to discredit it, it still gets a majority vote in the northeast. I don't know, Sarah here, yeah, she'll say something. I know one of her people, she know their family knows they eat because they have this support from Lula, and they don't forget that in an electoral way. During that period, the Workers' Party could do this and still maintain support, or at least neutrality, of the bourgeoisie and of the petty bourgeoisie, the middle class. And they also gave state support to all the businesses. And the Workers' Party government also maintained friendly relations with Venezuela, with Cuba, which of course Washington disapproved of. That doesn't mean Brazil was consistently anti-imperialist through that whole period. For example, the Brazilian military contributed to the occupation of Haiti during that time. They were the peacekeepers, so-called. Nevertheless, from the point of view of the more revolutionary governments, they want to have a Workers' Party government in Brazil rather than have one of the regular right-wing governments that's friendly to Washington, and certainly not someone like Bolsonaro from the ultra-right. Now, when the prices of the raw materials crashed after the financial crisis of 2008, and then again later on in 2011, it changed the game. The rich wanted no more of the sharing of the wealth. They wanted everything. And they weren't going to let the Workers' Party stay in the government. So they mobilized against it. They actually, I mean, there's a lot of corruption in all capitalist governments, including the U.S. government, though it's kind of hidden here. And since the bourgeoisie is so powerful, they figure out how to change the laws so that they're not breaking them anymore. But in Brazil, there's definitely a lot of corruption, and a lot of the government people were involved in it. And there was a campaign against them by the judiciary and by the press and by the media. And the media, of course, they accused everyone of corruption, all the political parties. They focused their attack especially on the Workers' Party, because that's who they wanted to get. They wanted to get out. So the upshot of years of these attacks on the government is that people start thinking, oh, they're all crooks, everybody's bad, and the Workers' Party are the worst of it. I mean, that ideology gets implanted. And they led the attack, and that's how they got Dilma Rousseff out on not a very strong case against her at all. She just moved some money around in the budget in order to get money, and they managed to build that into an impeachment trial, and they got her out. And then they also got Lula and attacked him and put him in jail for alleged corruption. They did that because Lula was able, since he was president, he could do it for 2 terms, and then Dilma Rousseff was president. He could run again in this election. And he was leading the polls. He was getting 45%. Everybody else was getting 10 and 5 and 15 and stuff. And so they, in order to keep him from running in the election, they put him in jail. Not only, he's still the most popular political figure in Brazil, for the reasons we discussed. He might have won in the first round. Not only did they put him in jail, but they made it illegal for Haddad and Manuel Dávila to campaign with like pictures of Lula showing that Lula supports him because they don't want the symbol. You know? Now, as I said, the usual bourgeois parties, even more so than in Italy and some of the other European countries, have been thoroughly discredited. The president who replaced Rousseff, Temer, he had Michel Temer, he had an approval rating of less than 5%. Yeah. In the first round of the elections, there were 3 or 4 of the usual bourgeois parties running, or different candidates running. One got a little more than 5%, the rest got less. So as it was, Bolsonaro got 46% and Haddad got 29%. And then the rest, and there was a center-left party that got about 12%. And the rest was spread around these parties and a couple of left-wing parties. Didn't get very much in the way of votes. Now, Bolsonaro was almost almost killed in an assassination attempt on September 6th. Someone stuck a knife in his abdomen. And many analysts say that this helped him, considering that he survived it. I mean, he almost didn't survive. But considering that he survived, it helped him because not only did he get sympathy for it, but it enabled him to stay in a hospital and not talk. He's pretending. I mean, he's been in the National Assembly for I think 7 terms, 14 years. Hasn't done anything. Has just as much a part of the apparatus as anything as anybody else. But he pretends he's an outsider. You know how they do that? They do that here too. I mean, Trump did it too in a way. But Trump was very well known. This guy is not as well known. In a way, that worked in his favor because they attribute things to him. He runs on like law and order, God, order first, God over for the people, something like that. He has the support of. He doesn't have a mass fascist organization like Hitler and Mussolini did. Of course, neither does Trump. But that doesn't remove his threat to democratic rights. He has supported the military, the active politicals in the military, and he has supported the military police. I mean, he promotes the policy of going into the favelas and killing supposed delinquents, they would call them. His vice president is a general. He has electoral support from the evangelical churches. That is his one base of mass support. You know, they're about 20% of the 20% of Brazilians belong to these evangelical churches, which were implanted there from the U.S. as an antidote to liberation theology, which was taking hold in parts of the Catholic Church. And they have grown and they're influential. They have their own media, and their members sometimes just listen to that. So the reason I bother to explain that stuff is that you have to think if Brazil, half the people in Brazil are women, half the people are people of color, or we would think of them here as people of color. They're being directly attacked by Bolsonaro. Well, how is he getting a majority vote? There has to be something that has ideological control of the people, or the failure of the left to move forward and create the organizations that could fight this kind of thing. Right now, the Haddad ticket is attempting to expand its support and to mobilize also on the streets. The goal seems to be there's 2 main points. Expose Bolsonaro's program as pro-rich, which he was able to hide, and arouse people to vote to defend democracy against fascism. We might want him to more campaign in support of the poor, ending unemployment and things like that. But we'll see how they make out there. Last Monday, the Communist Party of Brazil, the Workers' Party, the Socialist Party, the Brazilian Communist Party, the PSOL, if you know what that is, the Party of Socialism, and I lost it. But sort of a Trotskyist organization who would run independently. They got about 0.5% of the vote. And then the other group that supports the ticket, they launched something called the Democratic Front in support of the candidacy of Haddad and to the presidency of the Republic. According to the Front, the vote for Haddad is to respond to the threat of fascism symbolized by Bolsonaro. Now, you might know that a couple of Saturdays ago, before the first election, there was a demonstration led by women in Brazil hundreds of thousands of people went out in a bunch of cities called Eddie Now, Not Him, a movement that brought, and this movement has inspired another round of demonstration that's set for the day after tomorrow, for Saturday in Brazil. They want to bring out the masses into the streets as part of the election campaign, but it's also a mobilization. And definitely if we were there, we would be mobilizing for this. They're backed by the Democratic fronts and by organizations like the homeless movement and the landless movement, LGBT groups, women's groups, unions, etc. We will get a little measure Saturday of how much the success they've had in mobilizing the population, and we can hope they win. And if they don't win, that it inspires even more struggle in Brazil, and we'll be in solidarity with them, just as they would be with our struggle against the fascists here. Thank you.